Okay, now we're going to talk about the fundamentals of working with the OneLogin APIs. We've talked about the 4 REST verbs, and now we'll start to talk a little bit more about how they relate to different API actions. We'll talk a little bit about how the permissions of a key affect what verbs are available for use. I'll talk a little bit about the headers passed into the various endpoints, and I'll talk a little bit about the query parameters that can be passed into various API calls. And then finally, we'll do a little exploration of the APIs using a tool called Postman. Now, before we talked about the 4 different verb types. In this case, these verbs correspond to different permissions you need on a key. Get only requires that you have read permission. However, delete, put, and post all require that your key has write permission. Read and write permission for what? We have 5 different key types. The simplest and least privileged of all the key types is an authentication-only key. This allows write access, but only against endpoints that require things like a username and password. There's the user's permissions. This covers things like user events and the authentication endpoints. And finally, the all permission includes other endpoints, such as roles, passwords, anything that affects user permissions and security. Part of the reasoning behind this is we never wanted to allow for what's called escalation of privileges. That's a fancy word for saying we don't want to give someone permission to give themselves more permissions. So in the case of the user endpoints, for example, we don't want to allow someone with read user permission the ability to change somebody's passwords. Why? Because it would be trivial for them to go in and say, great, I'm going to change the super user's password to a password of my choosing. I'm then going to log in as the super user. And now that I have super user access, I'm going to give myself a new key that gives me manage all permission. That's a pretty common example of what's called escalation of privileges. Next up, we'll talk a little bit about query parameters. Query parameters allow you to hit one of our API endpoints, but then perform additional operations on that endpoint, such as searching, sorting, limiting the amount of data you get, pagination, or the ability to go through large sets of data, as well as things like since and until, and finally combining all of these parameters together. So let's talk a little bit about how we can explore these APIs. So now I'm going to walk you through how to use a tool like Postman in order to access our APIs. If you go to our developer site, developers.onelogin.com, and look at our API documentation, you'll find Postman collections for all of our API endpoints. Once you download these, you should be able to import them into Postman and use them in order to test out various calls. These examples have all come from our Postman collection. So in this case, we're looking at the collection of OAuth2 tokens. And here you see the various calls to generate, refresh, revoke, and get the rate limit for a token. One of the things worth mentioning is all of these examples have been set up assuming you have an environment set up. An environment in Postman is really just a way of defining a series of variables that should be used for all calls. So in this case, when we look at the actual URL that we're going to hit with this particular endpoint, you'll notice in these curly brackets it says US or EU. And when we go to the headers for this particular one, you'll see that the client ID and client secret are also set to be variables. So if you notice, if I go into the settings for my environment and take a look at them, you'll see we've defined a series of variables here. Email, host, the US or the EU shard, for most folks it'll be US, and what my client ID and client secret are. Now these are the client ID and client secrets I was given by my administrator in order to make API calls. You'll also see a refresh token and an access token in here, and I'll go over these in a moment. So with these set, with my client ID and my client secret already set, I simply send this command to the server. And we get back a status of success, 200, And then within the data block, we can see that there's an access token and a refresh token. So I'm going to grab this access token, copy it, and then go into my environment. Oops. And just update my access token. And I'll paste that in there. And hit update. I'll also be able to go in and grab the refresh token. And go into my environment again. And then save that. Now, once that these have been set in my environment variables, I can go to any other OneLogin endpoint, say the getEvents endpoint. And if you'll note here, again, we're using environment variables, US or EU. It's been set to US. And if I look at the headers, you'll see here that these API endpoints are all set up to use an authorization header of type bearer with an access token. And that's the access token I just got from my generate tokens call. So when I send this, I get success. And just as a quick example of how tokens get revoked when you generate new ones, if I were to go back to my generate tokens endpoint and request a new token be generated, I'm just going to copy this real quick. If I go back to that API endpoint I just called, the events endpoint, and this is still set to the old value. If I send this, I get an authentication failure. Why? Because the act of generating a new token invalidates the old one. But if I go back into my environment variable and edit this, and update my access token to be the new one, and then retry the endpoint, it succeeds.